Welcome, everybody. There are more than 30 legislative leaders from 25 states on this call, along with some 40 members of the Foundation's Business Advisory Council. We have the makings of a very robust conversation, and I want to thank all of you for taking time out of your schedules to join us. Our primary goal with these webinars and Zoom meetings is to connect each of you to each other so you can share your experiences and insights, ask questions, and perhaps just as important, learn that you are not alone in this. All of the people in this room, this virtual room, share your pain. Others who have gone before you have faced similar existential threats, and many of you have risen to the occasion, finding that inner strength to lead us through times of crisis. Today's webinar is the first in a series of conversations we're going to be having over the next several months focusing on leadership in crisis. To get us started, we're pleased to introduce to you Professor Nancy Koehn, distinguished historian at the Harvard Business School, where she holds the James E. Robinson Chair in Business Administration. Nancy's research focuses on how leaders, past and present, craft lives of purpose, worth, and impact. Her most recent book, Forged in Crisis, The Power of Courageous Leadership in Turbulent Times, eloquently proves the point that courageous leaders are not born, but made. If that's the case, then we're in fertile territory, because we're all sitting on the anvil of a national and global pandemic that is almost certain to give rise to new courageous leaders able to safely guide us through these turbulent and uncertain times. I have no doubt that many of the legislative leaders and business leaders that are in this room today with us will rise to this occasion. It's no hyperbole when I say to you that America needs your leadership now more than ever. Your steady hand and your ability to bring us together will most certainly affect how well we deal with this crisis at hand and how successful we are at rebuilding our society. Nancy, I want to welcome you and thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve. It's just a huge pleasure to be here, real honor. And good morning and good afternoon to all the participants here in the room. Let me say a couple of things by way of process, if you will, and then I want to offer a few comments before we turn to some rules of the road. First, we're going to leave plenty of time for questions and discussion. So we'll take that up with Tom and Steve, about halfway through our time together. Second, I don't use a lot of PowerPoints. I have none today. I'm a historian. I got tenure at the Harvard Business School almost 17 years ago, and I could stop worrying about PowerPoint slides then because I was given lifelong job security. And I've just found that if I speak and you listen and listen to your head and what's happening to you as I speak and what you're making connections with, that can be very valuable. But because I know we like to take notes and like to have some marking of a conversation, we'll be sending out a list of takeaways from the conversation in the next day or so. So have no fear, there will be a record of the conversation. Let me begin by saying I've been studying leaders in crisis and how they get better for about 20 years at the Harvard Business School. And I never, ever expected to live through anything like the very rapid fire arrival of the COVID-19 pandemic, its global scope, and the consequent crises that it's created, the most obvious of which, or perhaps the most significant of which, alongside the virus and its spread and its impact, is the economic crisis. But there's a host of other knots, other waves that are following those two tsunamis. So I never expected it. Having said that, and being fascinated by this and scared and exhausted by this moment, I keep coming back to a host of good practices and tools that really courageous leaders in crises have used at other moments, many of which were comparable to this one. For example, the American Civil War or the Great Depression, or World War II at different places and different moments in that 6-year conflict around the world. Although I know the United States side of that much better than I do the European or other parts of the world side. So we're not the first. That's the first thing I want to say by way of opening comments. Secondly, here's what I've learned in all this research. And I don't just study leaders in the past in crises. I spend a lot of time studying leaders in the present as well. And here's what I've learned, that crises are amazing. So first offering, crises are amazing greenhouses, crucibles, right? Steve was talking about an anvil, forges where courageous leaders emerge stronger, more resilient, more mission focused, and with more impact and more ability to incite others to rise than in times of relative stability. So the first message I have to offer is that leaders, as Steve was saying, are made, they're not born, and they're made particularly forcefully, with particular speed in a crisis. And I don't understand, for all my research, the exact little causal vectors for why that's the case. But I can tell you with a quote from Lincoln that what I think happened. So in 1862, and the end of that year in the war, which was another canyon in terms of the military fortunes of the government, the Union, to save the Union, Lincoln said in his annual message to Congress, right, the dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. And that is what happens in a crisis. Like, the dogmas of the quiet past don't help us. We don't have, a manual or a kind of 7-point, template that we're going to follow. We don't have a GPS set of directions. And so somehow in all that ambiguity and in all that novelty and in all that exigency, particularly in a crisis where the stakes, just like our crisis, are life and death, in all that urgency, we begin to think anew and act anew, and courageous leaders raise the level of their game. Not everyone chooses to do this. This will happen. It's not a kind of, law of nature, but it does happen for leaders who choose to say, I don't know how I'm going to get through this, and I don't know how I'm going to make myself better in the doing, but I am going to do what it takes, inside and out, to raise the level of my game and our game. And then really, really good stuff starts happening. So the second thing is leaders get better in crises by leaps and bounds. Third offering I want to make in crises. In my book, the beginning of this last book, right, Forged in Crisis, which is a story of 5 extraordinary kind of masters of crisis leadership, all of whom begin the crisis that they're going to navigate through with a personal crisis. So it's kind of personal meets professional, or personal meets the larger world. I stumbled on this definition when I was writing this book, and it's at the beginning of the book, of courageous leadership. So let me just offer it to you, and let me tell you why I think it has particular resonance in a crisis, particularly this crisis. So this is a definition of courageous leadership from an American writer named David Foster Wallace, not a leadership expert. And he coined this in an essay he wrote many years ago in 2000 when he was following John McCain around on his first presidential bid. He said, courageous leaders are individuals who help us overcome the limitations of our own weaknesses, selfishness, laziness, and fears, and get us to do harder, better things than we can get ourselves to do on our own. Leaders are individuals who help us push through the boundaries of selfishness, laziness, weakness, fears, and get us to do harder, better things so we can get ourselves to do on our own. And just think about how important that is in a crisis, particularly a crisis like the COVID crisis, where the individual interest is completely now inextricably tied with the collective interest. We're not going to beat this virus until we all realize that my protecting, right, myself from protecting other people from anything I might have is like my responsibility, and that my well-being in terms of getting a different, better, safer society is all tied up with my living on that responsibility in service to our society. So great leaders get better in crises and help other people raise the level of their game, particularly in relation to fear. 2 more things I want to offer, and then I'll go through a few rules of the road. The 4th thing I want to offer by introductory food for thought something to chew on, is that the word apocalypse in Greek, I learned this at the very beginning of the pandemic, means revelation. Apocalypse means revelation in Greek. Not revelation like the Bible, although there's elements of the revealing in that book of the Bible, but revelation in the sense of what is real and true is suddenly disclosed and obvious. And if you start thinking about that, right, then you can think of lots of ways in which that seems so true for this COVID-19 crisis, right? Great leaders are emerging or getting better. Weak leaders that's becoming clear, right? Systemic vulnerabilities are becoming clear. Systemic flexibility and agility is becoming manifest. So my point is that everyone is taking this in, and because this is such a seismic event, because it is like World War II in terms of the impact it's having on our world, right? People will remember how leaders, how organizations, how governments, how businesses conduct themselves and make decisions going forward based on the character and values that they saw in that crisis. So that's something for all of us to think about, right? We're all on stage in some very real sense where, again, the stakes are life and death. All right, the last opening comment I want to make is that I don't think we really want right now, we're now seeing, all of you are living this and leading this, we're now, if you will, at the end perhaps of the first chapter of this multi-chapter story that is the COVID pandemic and its consequent huge economic downturn. We're at the end of a multi-chapter story. It's not an article, it's not an essay, it's a multi-chapter book. It might not be Bleak House or War and Peace, but it's not, right? It's not a post or some kind of short thing. It's a long-term crisis that will have varying degrees of intensity to it. And if we are, as Churchill said at the end of the North Africa, or in 1942, at the end of what was really the major part of the North Africa campaign, he said, we're not at the end, we're not at the beginning of the end, we are perhaps at the end of the beginning. We are now at the end of the beginning of chapter 1 here and moving into reopening with different kind of ways of doing that around the country and around the world. But in that context, last thing I want to say about opening is it's really going to be important for leaders not to jump on the idea that we're going to be back at normal at a certain date, or that we even know what normal is anymore. Because the COVID pandemic and its wake is reshaping the world. So I think we want to start as leaders to entertain the possibility that what we're moving toward is the post-COVID-19 world, as opposed to a normal, or this many degrees from what we had in January of 2020 or in December of 2019. So this is a seismic event. And it's up to leaders to help people, their constituents, their followers, all the people that look to them to guidance, to help people move through those different chapters in ways that help them push through fears, right? Weaknesses, selfishness, laziness, and do better, harder things. All right, let me mention a number of rules of the road with some historical kind of tie-ins before we talk about some of these. So the first rule of the road in any kind of, crisis, including surgical strike crises, a terrible, natural disaster, and then the cleanup for that and the learning for that. But this is true for any crisis. It's particularly important in this kind of multi-chapter crisis. And that is that leaders and their followers need to get comfortable with ambiguity, uncertainty, too little information, and obviously constant change. And that means, right, ambiguity, uncertainty, too little information. Colin Powell once said, in a crisis, you're going to have to act with roughly between 45 and 70% of the information you usually have and need to make a decision. But you can't act with less than 40 because you just can't be sure of making a decent decision. And if you wait until you have more than 70, which is hard to have in a crisis, the moment will have passed because there's so much urgency and so much change that you'll have lost the opportunity. So we're going to act with less than ideal information, less than optimal amounts of information. That's part of the crisis. But we have to get comfortable with all of that because it's here to stay. And that means we have to learn or get comfortable with without a map, without a set of GPS coordinates, with, as Lincoln said at the end of the Civil War, navigating point to point. All crisis management and crisis leadership is founded primarily on leaders helping steer their organizations, their people, point to point, right? Through the high winds and the big waves toward the next star if there's clarity in the horizon, the next star. And as you navigate, right, through the lowest winds the slowest winds and the lowest waves you can find, you're always prepared to shift gears, pivot, and navigate another way as the circumstance, as the seas change. So the first rule of the road is get comfortable navigating point to point. Get comfortable, right, with insufficient information, ambiguity, uncertainty, and constant change. But the navigating point to point is really, really important. And the ability to keep pivoting without looking backwards and thinking, oh my God, why did we make that mistake? Or why didn't we head that way in the first place? Because you don't have time to, have kind of a great amount of energy spent on blame or recrimination. Learn forward, you learn from what you did, and you pivot quickly, right? And you keep learning forward, as the crisis management experts say. So first rule of the road, all that comfort with all that uncertainty, navigating point to point, pivoting quickly, and then learning forward. The second rule of the road, very much related to this cluster of comments I'm making now, is that communication, I want to be more specific about this, so just excuse the broadness, the breadth of what I'm saying here, and the vagueness, therefore, of it at the beginning. Communication, constant, regular, in the same medium, is about, if not your most powerful tool, it's one of the 1, 2, or 3 most powerful tools you have in your belt to help your people navigate the crisis and to help them be part of the solution, not part of the problem through panicking or hoarding or disruption that's not helping anybody or anything. So what do I mean by communication? I mean that in a crisis, when everyone's antennae, so to speak, are heightened, when everyone is anxious, when everyone is paying extraordinary attention to their leaders because they're looking for lighthouses and they're looking for people that can help them stay grounded, help them be their best. They're looking for it, even if they don't ask for it, even if they don't consciously know it. They're looking for ways to stay more grounded, help protect their families, right? Think about how to, get the economic support they need or to find the safe work they need, etc. They're looking for leaders for this. They want to hear from you. They want to hear from you, if not every day, they want to hear from you once a week. And they want to hear from you on a regular basis because the very regularity of the frequency with which you communicate and the fact that you always do it on a Zoom meeting or a conference call or a kind of video town hall on WebEx, whatever the medium that you're using, the very continuity of the timing and the medium is in itself a kind of form of grounding people. Oh, on Tuesday, Legislator McCracken addresses us in the evening at 7 o'clock. I don't want to miss it. I want to hear what's going on in the state's, the district's reopening plan and what we know about that and how it's working and what it means for my business or my family. So the very act, remember FDR's fireside chats in the 1930s when there was an extraordinary amount of fear and panic and hoarding, right, of money and a liquidity crisis, impending financial crisis, right? Those fireside chats were a very good example of what I'm talking about. But the regularity, the cadence of when you do it, and the medium matter a lot. Now, let me get more specific still. So every second rule of the road, communication. So every time you speak to your team, but particularly to your constituents, your people, your followers, your designated followers. This is true for everyone. It's even more true for your constituents. Let's use that example here because it's a perfect one. You want to have a combination of brutal honesty and credible hope. There has to be brutal honesty. People need information. It's constantly changing. So they need information, and their antennae are very good for what they trust and what they don't trust. And there's a good filter for when someone's telling the truth and when they're not. And the brutal honesty of COVID incidents or of COVID testing or of contact tracing or of hospital utilization in any region is what everyone now understands is critical to understanding a region or a district's ability to navigate through the pandemic and to move on to what might happen in economic recovery, and doing that safely so people buy and come to work. So the brutal honesty is essential, and the information is essential, and people won't trust leaders who don't have that candor and that truth with them. So that's the first thing. But you have to have the brutal honesty. Here are the challenges, right? Here's where we are. Here's what we think is coming next, and maybe what we think is over the or on the horizon as the next wave coming at us after that. Our best information today tells us that. This is going to be hard. This is where we've made some success. This is what we're doing about those waves. And this is how we're, tacking and using our sails, but it's hard. And we have a ways to go and many waves, a ways to go and many stormy waters to traverse as we move forward. So brutal honesty, right? Married to credible hope. What's that mean? Credible hope means what are the resources we bring as a people, as a district, as a set of citizens to bear, or as a set of other broader stakeholders than just your constituents? What are the resources we bring to bear to meet those challenges? Some of those resources are tangible, right? This is what's happening to hospital capacity. This is what's happening to our testing program. This is what's happening to our economic recovery efforts. This is what's happening in our unemployment offices because they've been swamped, right? This is what's happening with our food banks in my district, right? These are the resources. We have them. They need to be enumerated for people so people realize, right, that they are part of the solution and things are being done to meet the challenges. And so that they can be enlisted, right, or called to help in whatever way, from writing a check to a food bank if they can, to figuring out how to help other people, keep their masks on and socially distance. So the credible hope has tangible elements. It also has intangible resources. This is really important. So that's about our collective courage, our resolve, our determination, our sense of community and our unity, right? Unity. We need many more leaders today in this country at all levels talking about the ability of the American people to unite, instead of the media telling us at every single juncture that we are completely divided. Right? Americans, and that unity is critical. And so you have a set of reasons to hope, from what are the resources we bring to bear, tangible and intangible, to what are examples of places where we're making a difference, where we've dealt with that wave and now we've hit smoother seas. So that credible hope is balanced off. Think of it as like a balance sheet. Here are our liabilities on the brutal honesty, and here are our assets. But you have to have both, and they have to be part of every single, right, moment of communication with your people. That is how you build, right, a grounded, called to action, right, safe citizenry that wants to be part of the solution, and not only for the larger community, but for their families in their best possible way. That's how we get them to do harder, better things than they can get themselves to do on their own. Let me give you one last tiny example of this. And you mentioned several other rules of the road before we open it up for questions. In 1940, which was particularly the spring of 1940, when Churchill had just become prime minister in the early, really the first year of the Second World War, when Britain, by the end of May 1940, stood alone in Europe without a lot of US involvement in the war, stood alone holding off the Nazi threat. Churchill would begin speeches like this. This is an example of he understood brutal honesty and credible hope magnificently. And I'm now quoting him from one speech in the third week of May. "The news from France is very bad." And then he proceeds to, this is pre-Dunkirk, so it's right about now as an anniversary, just before the evacuation. So he's giving the brutal honesty of what's happening in the war to the House of Commons. And then he ends the speech by talking about what the reserves and the resources are of the British people. And we know some of those speeches very, very well. We will not surrender. We will fight in the beaches, right? We will fight on the beaches. We will fight in the fields. We will fight with pitchforks. So that kind of communication, there's an example of where that kind of communication, which is the what we want good leaders to use, it's really essential, can make an enormous difference, right? All right, let me mention three other rules of the road that are important a little bit more briefly. It's absolutely important, it's absolutely vital that crisis leaders manage the energy of their team. There's some of that you'll do with the broader group of your followers. But this idea that you need to keep your fingers on the morale and the pulse of your immediate team is absolutely essential. I'm writing a case now at the Harvard Business School about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and in particular, not about international security or the missile gap or anything like that between the Soviet Union and the United States in the early 60s. I'm writing about the emotional intelligence and forbearance and awareness of John Kennedy, Nikita Khrushchev a little bit later in the crisis, partly enabled by Kennedy in their backdoor communication or back channel communication, and a few other people that were part of what was called the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, the ExComm, the real decision makers in the United States side of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it's just so exceptionally clear that what Kennedy was trying to do in lots of ways with that disparate group of men that was the ExComm, from the Joint Chiefs of Staff to cabinet secretaries to advisors, and to ex-ambassadors to the Soviet Union, was a lot of what he's doing as he tries to kind of navigate a path through this extremely tense 2-week period when he's determined to get the missiles out of Cuba, the Soviet missiles that have been placed there, and avoid an out-of-control, swift military escalation that will end in nuclear war. It's so clear that what he's doing, just like the explorer Ernest Shackleton marooned on the ice in 1915 and 16 with his team of people in Antarctica, he's managing the energy of his team, including their fears, including their wish to try and do something quickly because they're so keen and anxious. And so managing the energy of your people, let's remember Roosevelt's second paragraph of his first inaugural in 1933, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. Paralyzing, right, nameless, shapeless fear that distorts attempts to distort solutions to our problems. So this idea that you address your team's fears and you keep your fingers on their energy and their morale is absolutely essential to giving you the kind of high functioning group coalition you need to do the very difficult work you have to do. All right, two more quick rules of the road, but they're equally important. All these are essential. I don't see any of them as negotiable in all my work, and I don't know any leader that kind of, dialed one down and concentrated on one or two. They did all of these. So remember when we got on airplanes several months ago, and before you take off, as you're taxiing down the runway, the head flight attendant says, in the event of a fall in cabin pressure, an oxygen mask will fall from the ceiling. Place your oxygen mask. They tell you how to do it. Place yours on and secure your mask first before helping anyone else. So this is the rule of the road that has two parts that I think is absolutely essential, and that is you have to put your oxygen mask on first, meaning you have to take really good care of yourself. You have to feed and water yourself through this crisis. That means, because it's a long one, because so many people are so dependent on what you're doing, and because you have such an outsized impact, so much bigger than the impact you had 3 months ago. But that means that if you fail, either for your constituents, your team, or your family, right, the mission is in real trouble, and with lots of reverberating impact, destructive impact or deteriorating impact, like ripples in a pond. So what does feeding and watering yourself mean? It means very simple but important stuff, because this is really tiring, and Zoom is a little bit soul destroying, and we're all doing so much work on Zoom. It means you got to sleep enough, you got to eat decently, you got to move. I'm writing a little piece on mobility and leaders who walked, right? From Steve Jobs to Charles Darwin to Abraham Lincoln, who paced, to John Kennedy. They used pacing, moving, as a way of getting out of the thick of the team and the pressure, and just kind of without a gadget, and letting their minds, right, kind of just ground, calm, and the solutions begin to percolate up, or clarity begin to emerge. So you got to move enough. You have to have some device-free moments, right? A few of them in a day, real ones, not 1 minute while you get up and go to the kitchen or, talk to your partner. You need a few more. I recommend everyone take 2 20-minute device-free moments. That's really important, really, really important. And, you have to, in a sense, find ways every day, usually in the evening for most people, I think, leaders, to recover. That means Lincoln used to pace the halls and sing bawdy songs and tell raunchy jokes with his secretaries. Kennedy liked to swim and play, big band records. All kinds of Shackleton liked to dance across the ice and play the banjo or recite poetry. Whatever it is that you play the piano, watch your daughter, cycling on the driveway, whatever it is, dance with your dog. I'm currently watching a lot of old Hugh Grant and Harrison Ford movies at night. Whatever it is, you need some recovery time every day away from the grinding, pounding pressures of this crisis, both for you, your constituents, and your family, who are all taking cues from you all the time. Okay, last rule of the road, and then we'll open it up here. And it's a subtle one, but it's really powerful. And that is that I use these, none of these rules of the road are not part of good leadership in times of stability. It's just they're much more important in times of crisis. And this one is just like the rest. It's much more important when the stakes are as high as they are now. And that is that it's absolutely critical that you show up in service to your mission. What do I mean by that? I mean that because we are taking all these cues, your followers, your kids, when you walk into the kitchen in the morning, your team when they pick up the phone when you call them or they're calling you. Everyone's taking cues from you. They're watching you. It's not just what you say. It's not just what you do. It's like, what's his or her energy like? Do they look confident? Do they look grounded? Are their shoulders back? Are they listening well? Are they calm? Are they centered? Are they the ballast in the center of the storm? Those are things that people put as much weight on, and that they are watching with you, even though you don't know it. There's no reason you should know it, but I'm telling you, it is the case. And they're drawing conclusions. And what we want them to be drawing from that, whether you are sure on any given day that you are confident and on it all and ready to go, because no one can be that way every day, you have to show up, right? Core tight, shoulders back, energy grounded, for all the people that are watching you and learning from you and being guided. Nelson Mandela, who knew a thing or two about fear and courage and life and death stakes, once said that courage is not the absence of fear. It's the ability to take the first step into the fear with your shoulders back and, standing tall, so to speak, and then realize that by standing tall in the face of fear, as opposed to, huddling, right, hunkering down and hoping you'll survive, by standing tall in the face of fear, you realize you can take the next step, and you are actually in the midst of fear and taking steps into it and standing tall and strong. And then when you look back over your shoulder, other people are following behind you. So showing up in service to your mission, feeding and watering yourself, recovering is your oxygen mask. And you got to put yours on first, because the world is depending on you in these critical, and as Steve said, the world has never needed you more than it needs you now. And it's going to continue to need you, my friends, for some time, and maybe for the rest of your leadership lives, because we're moving not toward the new normal, not at all. We're moving toward the post-COVID-19 world, and we would like that road to be shorter rather than longer. But it's not going to be real short. And the world is being transformed as we speak. So leaders of courage and character and competence are absolutely more than a search for the vaccine, more than caches of PPE, right? More than our ability to test the heck out of this virus, and then every single place in this country or around the world open up safely. More than all those other things, courageous leadership is our best resource, because all those things depend ultimately on worthy, right, strong, right, resilient leadership. All right, so let me pause there and we'll open it up for questions, comments, whatever's on your mind. I want to be helpful if I can.
Nancy, thank you so much for those thoughtful and inspiring words. This is Tom Little with the State Legislative Leaders Foundation. I'm going to be going through some of the questions that you ask. Continue to post those questions. We have several I'm going to pose to Nancy, but as we're doing that, please continue to post your questions on chat and the Q&A. Nancy, we had several questions. I think a lot of us were fascinated, including me, about the concept of kind of that balance between fear and hope. And in particular, in an extended crisis like this, when it seems like the promise of hope the tangible promise of hope right now seems kind of hard to grasp. How do you do that in a way that doesn't seem insincere and seem like you're just kind of blowing smoke here?
It's a great question. I think, again, you want to stay, you want to do two things with credible hope. You want to stay present because everything's changing every day, right? I mean, if any of you folks are following the COVID incident maps at Johns Hopkins or some other places, right, the situation changes every day in terms of where the virus is and what that means for decision making. So you have to be grounded in what's happening today, but you're also, in terms of the hope, and there's some scary things about that, but the challenges aren't all fear inducing, right? And so brutal honesty doesn't mean we're stirring up fear. It means we're talking honestly about what's to come and what we're dealing with and what the major waves are. Some of that's scary, some it isn't. But the hope piece is about, right, how we're dealing with today's challenges, what we have to deal with, right? And that includes things like all the innovations that you folks are part of, right? Whether you're organizing food that's in excess supply in farming regions of your state and moving it to places like this is happening in New York and Massachusetts, some other states, and moving it to food banks, or where you have a variety of volunteers coming from out of state, health workers to work. Those are all resources that are new that you're bringing in. Enumerating those. Let's start with first. Enumerating what we're doing. A lot of it novel, right? And a lot of it coming not just from the top down, but from the bottom or the middle of society up or onto the problem. That's incredibly, right, confidence inducing and hope creating. So the first thing is, right, we got to look broadly at what's happening. And that means we have to look largely outside the media, because all the media, right, it's a big spectrum of information provision. Most of the media is more interested in what is happening that's negative than what's happening that's positive. So we got to be broad and curious and diligent with our teams and ourselves about where we're finding out what are some of the resources we're bringing to bear. But another piece is keeping people's eyes on moving to the end. We are going to get through this. The world is not going to come to an end. This is not a sci-fi film in which we move to outer space. So we have to keep giving people examples of times when we have, as a society or as a community or as a country or as a world, moved through moments of great turbulence and great uncertainty. And that's really important. I don't mean that you become professional historians or that you become professional storytellers, but giving people, examples of where we have, if you will, conquered the Goliath of a major crisis is really important. So you have to be able to present that to people too, without, again, being Pollyanna-ish or being superficial or being insincere. So that's important. And the third thing I think that is really important is to find examples of people in your districts that are representative of people doing harder, better things than they would have been able to get themselves to do on their own. People kind of moving through the barriers of fear or laziness or selfishness or weakness. That's very important. I'm watching a number of different state leaders around the country do this. So they have, on a regular basis, as part of their town halls, an example, right, of a constituent who's done something innovative, interesting, brave in part of the solution. And that really, really helps people. It inspires them. It kind of tones their courage and their resilience muscles. And it makes them realize that it's not just, you know, a monolithic organization at the top of society that's going to solve this. We're going to solve it together. And that's really important. So I think the unity piece is, last thing I'll say, really important.
Great. Thank you. We've had a couple other questions, and you talked at the beginning about being comfortable with ambiguity. And in politics, that's tough. So what has your research shown in terms of followers' willingness to forgive wrong decisions when it was based on inadequate or short information? Let's say, you know, you based it on what information you had at the time, and you made a decision that turns out to be wrong.
Yep.
Can you survive that as a leader?
Absolutely. But it depends critically. I've done a lot of work, this we used to call crisis recovery work. And this is true in all kinds of crises, much smaller ones than COVID. It's true here in spades. I think it's actually going to be easier in COVID because the stakes are so high and people recognize the uncertainty in a way that they don't say when there's some kind of corporate liability issue. You know, Johnson & Johnson and, you know, the Tylenol poisoning in the 80s, or, you know, Ford and the Ford Explorer and tire problems, you know, the Ford Pinto, those kind of crises where a mistake was made, right? And there was a good reason for it. Some those different companies, different governments, different leaders handle crises and the mistakes very differently, but it depends critically. The forgiveness and sometimes even the forgetfulness of your constituents about a mistake depends critically on what you do, right, as it's discovered that it was a mistake, right? So do you say it was a mistake, or do you try and paper it over? Do you say, oh, we actually didn't know that, and therefore this is why we made the decision? Which, if that's the truth, people will believe you, and they will understand it, and they will completely forgive you. Or do you somehow try and pin the blame on someone else? Over and over and over, the research and the evidence is unequivocal. If there's a mistake made, you explain how the mistake was made, why it seemed like the right decision at the time, and you say, here's what we've learned from it. And that is the best and surest way. And this crisis is extremely ripe for all of us to make some mistakes, right? But then the admission, the response, the learning, and then here's where we're headed now, and these are the reasons we know we want to head this way. It's not quite a you know, a get out of jail free card in Monopoly, but it's darn close. So yes and yes and yes, but you have to own it and explain it and then move forward at the time.
I've got a question here that is a little more specific to legislative leaders. As we move forward, there's probably a looming conflict here with the executive branch. What do you do as a legislative leader when you're working with a branch that seems to want to go in a different direction? Perhaps they want to open more quickly than you do, or more slowly than you do. How can you find that balance and lead through that kind of institutional challenge?
So that's not new to the COVID-19 pandemic. Those challenges, all of the people in this room know better than I've studied them in many dimensions. This is not new. What's new is that the stakes are higher, and the media attention or the media scrutiny is higher. So I have come in the last several years of, and this is not a comment about one part of the media versus another, or one particular set of, you know, broadcasters or newspapers. This is a historian at the big picture of the media. I've come to think that the way we want to do a lot of important coalition building, right, attempts to find points of commonality, has to be outside public scrutiny. So I'm not suggesting, you know, we sign up for smoke-filled rooms. I'm suggesting that this is a little bit like the Cuban Missile Crisis. When the stakes are this high as they are right now around some of these conflicts, potential conflicts, I think we want to take a page out of JFK's book and figure out how we open up effective, credible, back-channel conversations that don't get attention and don't get elevated to the, to military readiness, using the analogy of the Cuban Missile Crisis, in the media, right? Or in public disruption space, so we can actually try and figure out how we find middle ground. That's what all good politics is about, building coalitions. And that's never been more important. So stay out of the public limelight, be careful about monolithic groups, and don't think that the media can tell you that because you're of this party or you're of that party or you're in this state or that state, you can't possibly get this done. This isn't about red and blue. It's about public servants trying to find a way to do the best they can with uncertain information and ambiguity around these huge thorny problems of disease incidence and containment and economic fallout, massive economic fallout. So we actually have to start getting much more creative, and we have to get much more interested in where there are bridges and commonalities, and take a deep, forbearing breath away from anger and quick reaction.
Along those same lines, Nancy, there's a question here that's talking about how do you, and again, specific to this case, sort of balance that fallout you're going to get if you press for the stay at home too long or you open the economy too early. It's almost, as the author of the question says, almost feels like you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't.
Well, at a large level, this is just incredibly difficult, right? You have this brand new virus that has very destructive effects for about 20% of every national population, right? 20%, between 18 and 20% is basically the global figure for hospitalizations. So a virus that has very deleterious effects, that is highly contagious, that's brand new, so we don't have a lot of tools. And because it's so contagious, right, the most effective tool we had in the first chapter was lockdown, and it turns out turning off the spigot on all economic activity is incredible. We've never done that like this before. This isn't like the mortgage crisis or the financial crisis. There's no big rat in the snake or a huge some kind of blockage in the plumbing. We just stopped economic activity, and you do that for safety, and yet that creates a host of other problems, including some health problems. So there is a way in which you're at the large level, damned if you do or you're damned if you don't. But then let's try and see clearly. Let's try and see as clearly as we can. We have to get the virus under some kind of microscope so we understand district by district, region by region in states, right, what it's doing and where it's headed. Because people aren't in any state, this isn't a political comment, people aren't in any state going to get back to any kind of oxygenated economic activity if they're scared for their lives. So we have to get the virus tracked and known. That's actually a critical recipe to getting people back in any kind of robust way to help drive economic activity and particularly job restoration up. So we have to be able to do that. And then we have to kind of, again, be thinking in these nuanced ways that I was suggesting in answer to the last question. Not it's all or nothing. It's not stay at home or restore all economic activity. Those two endpoints aren't real. So we have to figure out how we're gonna keep our hands tightly on the valve of the virus in terms of what's going on with it so we can adjust quickly, and how we're going to help people feel safe enough to go back to their jobs, to apply for other jobs, because there are lots of places in essential services where we need people to work, not enough to fill 38 million people unemployed, but we have to be able to, in a nuanced way, keep trying to understand how we can restart economic activity and do it so we're not doing anything that's so heavy and sledgehammer-like that we're really endangering the spread of the virus again. We're going to know a lot more about this, my friends, as we all know, by the middle of June, right? As we see what happens to virus incidents in states that have really begun to reopen with very broad platforms, some of which have done that. So we're going to learn a lot more by June 15th, but it's not one or the other. We have to, the economic cure ultimately will be about the virus with a rate of transmission ratio of less than 1. That is our biggest economic cure.
Great. I've got a question here.
We have to explain that to people so that our constituents don't think suddenly, because we're saying we need contact tracers, we're against economic activity. Actually, those are things that are completely aligned. So we have to keep explaining this to people, because the media and its interest in putting us in these dark, separate, angry boxes is getting in the way of solutions.
Great. We've got a question here. It sort of turns this on its head a little bit and says, what is the role of a follower when they perceive the leaders are failing?
Well, that's a great question. That's a great question. And I'm not sure I have a kind of one size fits all. I mean, historically, one of the things that's very interesting about really big crises is that followers that don't see good leadership, or they feel like leadership is failing them, some of those followers actually want to step up onto the stage and try and lead. And some of them were ambitious and interested in leading anyway, but some of them are people that are like, I got to do something here. And we're seeing lots of examples of that around the country in all kinds of different ways, people stepping up to lead. So one thing that happens is that we are, in effect, bad leaders in effect create the next generation of leaders who want to get into the game. I was listening to NPR yesterday, and all these doctors talking about getting ready to run for Congress or throwing their hats in the ring now, because they think we have to have a very different approach to pandemic preparation in Washington. So that's one thing. The second thing I think that happens is that the smart followers want to try and be part of the solution, and they will look for people that they think they can hitch their sail to who will help them do that. And then the other thing that happens, and so that's another really positive outcome. Something that's much less positive is if you have enough followers who, for whatever reason, think that largely, let's just give the example of the national level, national leadership across the board has failed them, then we have a problem. Because then we have, without credible leadership, right? Credible leadership that recognizes public interest as its calling, as its reason for existence, public interest. I didn't say red state or blue state. I didn't say Republican or Democrat. Public interest, because that should be able to swamp political divisions right now. And it has in a lot of crises in America. Then if you don't have people that will follow large institutions of power at the national level, well, then it becomes, who will we follow at the state level? And that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing, a lot of Americans now looking to their state representatives, their mayors, their governors for really their lighthouses to navigate this, because regardless of their political party, they're frustrated with the inaction or the incompetence or the ineffectiveness of parts of our national government. I mean that at both ends of the Pennsylvania Avenue.
And so I've read in several of your articles, you talk about moral purpose. How does moral purpose play into this for our leaders?
I think this crisis is ultimately going to be viewed as a moral one, because at issue, the fundamental issue is not the unemployment numbers, as terrible as they are. The fundamental issue is, 100,000 Americans have died, and we don't want another 100,000 to die, and we want as few as possible to die, and we actually don't want very many people to die anymore of this terrible virus. And so I think the moral issue is, who are the leaders that will emerge, that will be able to have the deftness and the emotional expansiveness to build bridges, to be able deft enough to say, look, we got to do both. We got to manage and understand the virus and its spread and adjust accordingly. And we got to do what we have to do to keep Americans at all levels fed and able to withstand, right, economic meltdown at the same time that we're trying to reignite parts of the economy. That's a complicated but ineluctable set of things that have to begin happening. And so we have to have leaders that aren't talking, it's all this or it's all that, and that aren't just pointing fingers of blame, that are able, like Lincoln or like Churchill or like Mandela, to say, we gotta figure out how to unite together and solve these complicated, interlaced problems in a way that doesn't make Americans choose between going to work and being worried about their life because they have, even if they're young, they have an elderly parent at home. So we have to find people that understand that in a life or death crisis, the person who can claim that kind of calling and then has the ability to articulate the complicated set of solutions and America's roles in that. Those are the people that are going to lead us to where a resilient people is meant to go. Those are the people that are going to bring Americans back into their stronger selves. We are waiting as a people to be called to this, and it's not red or blue. The fact that there's so much disruption right now by small numbers of people in selected parts of the country is not about Americans' wish for unity. It's about the lack of enough people at the top telling us that we are capable of much better and capable of unity and capable of understanding the complexity, right, of what we must do now.
We need those leaders looking for the better angels of our nature.
Absolutely. We found them before. We'd like to find them again because we all feel better about ourselves and our neighbors and our children when that's the place where we're operating.
Got a question here I think will be a good one to wrap up with. Can you suggest any resources or further reading that might be particularly helpful to legislators who would like to learn from history about how to handle this current crisis?
Why don't we do this? I would be remiss as a parent if I didn't mention my literary child, Forged in Crisis, which is good reading and full of leadership lessons in it. Although most of the things I'm talking about here are things that come out of the broader work behind the book rather than the book. But why don't we do this, Tom? Why don't I, in the takeaway sheet that I'm putting together, why don't I include some articles? How's that sound?
That would be great.
People don't necessarily have the bandwidth right now to pour through volumes of history or anything, just even business books on crisis leadership. Let me suggest 5 or 6 what I think really good articles with 1 or 2 historical reference points that might be helpful for people wanting to put it in a larger perspective. And I'll get that out tonight when I send you folks the takeaways. How's that sound?
That sounds perfect.
Yeah.
Great. I think
May I say one more thing?
Yeah, please. You want to make some closing comments?
I
here?
just want to make a closing benediction, please, because I had a chance a couple of weeks ago to address several hundred American mayors in a seminar very much like this. And these 2 seminars, this webinar and the one with the mayors, and then one other one I did with a number of doctors in emergency rooms who are trying to lead their teams, right? Their MAs, their PAs, their EMTs in this incredible moment, and all they're doing is a tsunami of COVID patients, and everyone is scared and so exhausted. These 3 webinars, and I've done maybe 50 in the last 10 weeks, have been the greatest privilege to do because you folks are our most important resource. And one thing is unambiguous to a historian right now in the middle of this changing story. The state government will emerge as the heroic, institution. State government. I'm not making a partisan comment. I'm making a comment full on. And so your roles right now and your ability to rise within yourself, to bridge, right, all kinds of different divisions that may not be so real or are maybe much more bridgeable than we think on first blush, and to find a way to help us navigate these interrelated issues without pigeonholing them. You are so important. You are so exactly where you are meant to be right now. And the world needs you more than it will ever need you again. Although by the time we get into the post-COVID world, your leadership will have already be here and you'll be in a different place vis-a-vis, I don't mean institutional, I mean vis-a-vis how you're thinking about your role, because it'll be so much bigger. But your importance now, not only, as Lincoln said, for today, but for a vast future, just simply cannot be underestimated. So it's a real privilege to be with you, and the world needs you.
Nancy, thank you so much for all of this, for spending this hour with us. Steve, I'm going to turn it back over to you for closing remarks. Nancy, thank you. It was fantastic.
Pleasure.
Nancy, that was wonderful. Your comments were inspiring and point on. I think we all took some good messages from from your observations, and it makes us feel like we aren't alone, that we've dealt with circumstances like this in the past and we've come out on top. But the key messages I took here were, as leaders, it's incumbent upon us to talk truth, to speak honestly to our constituents. It's important that we unite, that we put aside all of our, I'd call them now, petty partisan differences, and that we reunite as a country. Because as a country, and this is not hyperbole, as a country, we can accomplish great things. And I suspect that in these upcoming weeks and months, as Nancy's alluded to, and as we all know, there will be many opportunities for men and women in positions like yours, be they in business or in government or in academia or in other walks of life, to rise to the occasion and provide that kind of solace and help that we all need together. So this has been great. We're all kind of having Zoom fatigue at some points, but I find conversations like this with somebody who clearly has a mastery of the moment and can talk to us consequentially about what it takes to be an effective leader in times like this. I find that to be inspiring, and I hope you do as well. We're going to do this again. Next, in June, on the 23rd, we've invited Andy Card, who many of you will know, served as the Chief of Staff to President George W. Bush. I think he was the second longest serving Chief of Staff in our history. But Andy Card will be with us to talk to us again about a different form of responding to a crisis. And interviewing him will be our good friend, the former Speaker of the House, Joe Strauss. So that should be a great conversation. Again, I want to thank Nancy. You're wonderful. I appreciate you doing this for us. I hope we have many opportunities to do this, and I'll look very much forward to being able to getting together.
I know, we all will.
In a room, because that will happen.
Yeah.
So, all right. Without further ado, good luck to all of you. We'll be in touch, and thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.